friends! Thanks for joining us today at Copper's Kitchen. This is going to mark the beginning of a new series called Recipe Review, where I try out a few different recipes from various cookbooks, blogs, channels, to guide me as I explore different cuisines and techniques, and share with you my successes, failures, thoughts, and hindsight tips along the way. And being an amateur home cook, I thought the perfect book to start out with would be Samin Nosrat's James Beard Award-winning and New York Times best-selling cookbook, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Some of you might recognize her and the title from her Netflix docu-series, where she touches on each of her 4 defined pillars of what makes good cooking: salt, fat, acid, and heat. To start us off, I've chosen her Buttermilk-Marinated roast chicken, which she recommends to pair with the Panzanella, and since we are deep into November, we're going to go with the autumn version. Also, I'll be doing a follow-up series later in the week called What's for Leftovers, where I take the leftovers and repurpose them into a few new meals. Hit the subscribe button below to make sure you don't miss it. And without further ado, let's get cooking. Okay, so first step, salt the bird. I tried to get all sides evenly salted, top, bottom, under any wings and legs. And don't want to forget the inside too, especially considering we're cooking a whole piece of meat. Making sure it's properly salted is so important, and making sure it's flavored from the outside in. So once that's done, we want to set it to the side and work on the brine. Okay, so the buttermilk brine. I recommend just using a bowl or a big measuring cup. As cute as the little milk jug is, it just wasn't ideal. And as you can see, made quite the mess. But you'll just want to go ahead and stir in your salt to the buttermilk. Make sure that's much better incorporated than you'll see it was here in a moment. And then go get your chicken. Just use a bowl. So once I had both of those prepared, I went ahead and poured my buttermilk brine over the chicken. As you can see, there's that salt clump. So hopefully if you use a bowl, you won't have that problem. But I went ahead and really tried to move this chicken around to get all the salt evenly dispersed in there. Samin had used a Ziploc bag for hers, which would really help in massaging all that around and squishing it in there. But if you're using a bowl, just make sure that all sides are evenly coated with the buttermilk so that it can really coat the whole bird and do its job. Copper, he was very interested in this step. So I let mine brine overnight, and then it came time to prep it in the roasting pan. I wiped off the buttermilk, which I'd recommend doing this somewhere on a flat surface because it did get a little bit messy. That way cleanup is less of a hassle. You're supposed to tuck the wings under the chicken, which the recipe calls for cutting off the wing tips at the beginning. But in hindsight, I would leave them on there just because I think it would make tucking them under a lot easier. Mine kept having a tendency to keep popping back out. So that's something I would change moving forward. Then you want to go ahead and tie the drumsticks together with some cooking twine. Tuck any wings back under that have popped back out and get it all ready for roasting. And again, make sure you clean that surface well with some disinfecting spray because raw chicken. Okay, so here was my bird after it came out of the oven. Guys, it smelled so good. I know it looks a little dark on top, but trust me, it was still delicious. My bird was a little bigger than her recommended weight in the book, so I had to leave it in there a little longer to make sure it was cooked through. And honestly, I think that's just a testament to the buttermilk brine. It gives you that little bit of wiggle room if you need it, without letting the chicken get all dried out. Also, highly recommend you look up a carving video before just going at it. Eventually, I was able to get the drumsticks off, but the rest of it I just let cool and then picked off with my hands later. But overall, I would say this one was definitely a success. And next up, the Panzanella. I decided to begin by making the brown butter vinaigrette, which, as the name might imply, starts with making some brown butter. This is the first time I had made brown butter, and from some quick Googling, my main two takeaways were to 1, cut up the butter into smaller pieces for even melting, and 2, keep an eye on it, because once things start happening, they happen fast. So once I had the butter all cut up, I went ahead and placed it in a shallow pan over medium heat. That was another thing I saw online, is that you want to make sure whatever you're heating up in is in a shallow enough pan where you can see clearly the pieces as they brown at the bottom. I kept stirring as everything melted down just to make sure nothing burned. And about here is where I decided to pull it off the heat. Once things start to turn brown, you want to make sure to get it off the heat as soon as possible. So while that's set to the side to cool, I went ahead and minced up the shallot. Once that's finished, I went ahead and got all my other ingredients prepared to assemble the dressing. I spooned my shallots into the vinegar to macerate, and I did have some shallots left over, which I ended up using up in my leftovers video coming up later this week. And after those had sat in the vinegar for a little while, I went ahead and mixed them into the brown butter, vinegar and all. Gave that a little mix and added some salt and pepper, and then threw the lid on to give it a good shake. I really like using mason jars for dressings like vinaigrettes. It just makes it so easy to really emulsify everything together. Gave it a quick taste and decided to add just a pinch more salt. I ended up with quite a bit less than I expected. Browning the butter really gets rid of a lot of water content. I went from 8 tablespoons to about 4, so I did move it to a smaller jar after I was done. And with that, the brown butter vinaigrette was done. And really tasty too. Next, it was time to prep all the ingredients for the Panzanella. Now, if you're following her recipe, you'll notice that some of my portions are a little off. Panzanella is something that doesn't really keep or reheat well, so I did adjust the measurements so that I would only end up with about 2 servings. Her recipe made enough for 4 generous servings, and since I'm usually just cooking for myself, I was thinking it would probably be a good idea to repurpose some of those ingredients for other things. So I went ahead and destemmed the kale, chopped up the leaves, and make sure not to throw out those stems. I went ahead and diced them up and saved them for another meal. After the kale was done, I moved on to the butternut squash. These can be a little tricky to prepare. I've usually started just cutting these in half and roasting them with the skin on, then scooping out the flesh after it's done. But I'm guessing to get better browning on them, the recipe called for peeling and chopping up the squash into smaller pieces for roasting. I'm not sure if this is the best way to go about peeling it, but it worked okay for me. I'd highly recommend using a vegetable peeler though. The thought of using a knife for this would be a little intimidating. So once it was all peeled, I went ahead and cut off the top and the bottom, cut it in half, and then scooped out the seeds. From there I sliced it, and after looking at some of the slices that were more solid from the upper part of the squash, I decided to cut those in half again. Just because since I was tossing them in the oven to roast, I wanted to have the pieces be pretty equal in size, that way they would all roast evenly. Then I moved on to the red onion, which was pretty straightforward, just cut it in half and sliced it really thin. And next up was the bread for the croutons. I had never made croutons from a loaf of bread, but it was actually really fun. To make them less toothy, she suggests the option of cutting off the crust, which I decided to go for. I really liked the hand-torn look that she teaches, and that's definitely how I'll be making croutons from here on out. I sliced up the crusts real quick just to eat with some cheese on the side, which was actually a pretty nice little snack. Okay, so hazelnuts are a little pricey, so I ended up just getting a variety pack of like walnuts, cashews, and hazelnuts, and just picked out all the hazelnuts from it. I mean, I rarely use them, and since I only needed a little bit for the recipe, it worked out just fine, at about half the price. Although, as you'll see coming up, it was all for naught. But we haven't gotten there yet, so I went ahead and got all of my oils and vinegars measured, and I was ready to start cooking. Okay, so this was probably my favorite part of the recipe. It was so fun. And that was frying the sage leaves. I've never done this before, and I honestly was a little nervous on how it was gonna go, but they were so delicate and so cute, and the fry sound was just so satisfying. Just their little... so nice. I had planned to only do enough for 2 servings, but I had so much fun I ended up just doing the whole pack. I will be completely honest though, I tried one plain after it was fried, my sister tried one plain after it was fried, and we couldn't taste anything. Like, are our taste buds broken? I don't think so. Why could we not taste them? I don't know. But I mean, they had a really nice crunch. They were nice and salty. I would still highly recommend just for the experience. It was so fun. I just thought they would taste like more, but I did look it up and I guess it does have a mild flavor, so I mean, maybe our palates just aren't refined enough yet. But just look how cute they are! Okay, from there, I went ahead and got everything ready to throw in the oven to roast. I started by tossing the bread in the oil and got those all coated. Then I moved on to the butternut squash. I realized I forgot the salt, so I went back and added that too. Very important. Then I dropped the hazelnuts on a tray to toast off as well. While everything was in the oven, I went ahead and poured the red wine vinegar over my onions to macerate, and just gave those a little mix to make sure everything was evenly coated. Okay, so the croutons, beautiful, so crunchy, golden color, amazing. Butternut squash, got some great color on them as well, so tender, delicious. But my precious hazelnuts. At this point, I didn't have time to run back to the store. I'm sure they would have added some great flavor. Be better than me. Don't burn your hazelnuts. I believe in you. But the show must go on, and I proceeded on to assembling the salad. So in my fluster with the hazelnuts, I also forgot to hit record on massaging some of the dressing into the kale. So make sure to do that. She also threw some croutons in there for that first mix. I'm guessing just to have a blend of textures, so you have some crunchy fresh ones while also having some that have soaked in the dressing a little bit. So I had already done that, and then I went ahead and dropped in about half of the butternut squash and a good few forks of the red onions. If you are planning to reheat some of it the next day, I'd recommend leaving some of your croutons out just so they don't get soggy overnight. My sister ended up just eating the rest of those, so I didn't have any croutons left. I just ate the rest of the salad the next day. But you'll see where I did leave half of my butternut squash in a container because I repurposed those later in the week. So I just gave that another toss with a little more of the dressing and also crumbled some of my fried sage leaves on top. Again, if you don't want to go to the trouble of deep frying the sage, I personally don't think you'll be missing out on much flavor-wise, but at the same time, I had so much fun doing it, so no regrets. And then it was time to eat. So I would say both of these recipes were definitely a success. The Panzanella really did embody those fall flavors with the warm butternut squash, the hearty kale, and then the deep nutty flavor of the brown butter. I can only imagine that the hazelnuts would have added a great crunch to it as well. So if you guys decide to make this yourself, let me know how it goes. The chicken is definitely one that I'll be making again. It was so flavorful, and the meat was so tender and juicy on the inside. And since the brine was just buttermilk and salt, it really is such a classic, versatile way to prepare a chicken to pair with so many meals. I really hope you guys will come back later this week to see how everything was repurposed on What's for Leftovers. With such great building blocks, it really set us up for some great options. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it, and like the video if you enjoyed this recipe review. Thank you to Samin for sharing such a beautiful meal, and thank you for joining us here at Copper's Kitchen.